There is a door in the Palazzo Ducale in Venice that is 4 meters tall. The room it leads into seats perhaps 30 people comfortably. The ceiling above that room is 6 meters. Every human being who has walked through that door for the past 500 years has done so at a scale that makes them feel small, and the assumption has always been the same. This was ceremonial. This was meant to impress. Larger than life, because power should look larger than life. That explanation has been repeated so many times that no one asks the follow-up question. Impress whom? If the room seats 30 and 30 humans are already inside, you do not need a 4-meter door to make them feel inferior. They already feel inferior. You built the room to create that feeling. The door serves a different function. The door is sized for entry. And the thing entering was not the Duke. I want to be careful here, because this subject attracts a particular kind of thinking that runs ahead of the evidence. There are claims about ancient giants, about gods walking through history, about bloodlines and hidden races. Most of that literature collapses under basic scrutiny. But there is a layer beneath the mythology that the mythology has been covering, and that layer is architectural, economic, and documentable. The doors are real. The measurements are real. The historical gap between what was built and what we are told it was built for is real. And the economic logic of that gap, once you find it, does not let go. Start with the measurements. This is not a matter of interpretation. The Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris has nave portals that reach 10 meters in height. The central portal of Chartres Cathedral measures 8.7 meters. The royal portal doors themselves, the physical wooden and iron structures, are over 5 meters tall. Durham Cathedral in England, begun in 1093, has doorways that exceed 4 meters at the lesser entries and approach 6 at the primary west front. The Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, built in 537 AD, has bronze doors on its imperial entrance that stand 9 meters high. These are not unusual examples selected to make a point. They are standard. Open any architectural survey of pre-industrial religious construction across Europe, the Middle East, or Asia, and the proportions repeat so consistently that architectural historians have a term for the phenomenon. They call it the gigantic order, and they attribute it to the desire to evoke divine scale. Divine scale. That phrase is doing a great deal of work, and it has been doing that work for so long that architects and historians no longer examine what it means. It means we do not know why these proportions were chosen, so we have assigned the explanation to the domain of the spiritual, where measurements cannot follow. It is the same intellectual move that archaeology makes when it finds an object with no identifiable practical function. They call it ritual. They call it ceremonial. The word functions as a placeholder that prevents further inquiry. Here is what the placeholder has been covering. The economic history of pre-industrial Europe is, in large part, a history of energy. Not oil, not coal, not electricity. Animal power. Oxen, horses, and mules were the engines of every major construction project, every agricultural system, every long-distance transport network from roughly 500 AD through the early 1800s. We know this. It is not disputed. What is less commonly examined is the physical scale that animal-powered logistics required, because once you examine it, the architecture starts to make a different kind of sense. A working draft horse stands between 1.6 and 1.9 meters at the shoulder. When you add the height of a loaded cart, a standard commercial vehicle of the medieval or early modern period, you reach roughly 3 to 3.5 meters for the vehicle alone. Now add the driver sitting above the load. You are approaching 4 meters as a functional minimum for any entry point that needed to admit working animals with cargo. And this was not an occasional need. This was the operational reality of every institution that processed goods, stored materials, fed populations, or maintained any kind of logistical infrastructure. The question that follows is obvious. Why would a cathedral need that infrastructure? The answer that most people have not been given is that cathedrals, for most of their history, were not primarily spaces of spiritual retreat. They were economic institutions. The largest ones were also the largest storehouses in their regions. They held grain. They processed wool. They accepted tithes in agricultural produce that had to be transported, stored, and sometimes redistributed. The tithe, the mandatory donation of 1/10 of agricultural production to the church, was not a spiritual abstraction. It was a physical transfer of material goods that arrived on carts, on pack animals carried by labourers who brought everything through doors large enough to admit the means of transport. This is documented. The economic historians have written it clearly, though rarely in the same books as the architectural historians. Medieval cathedrals functioned as combination worship spaces, granaries, treasuries, community halls, and logistics centres. The great abbeys of France and England controlled agricultural land measured in the tens of thousands of acres. The Abbey of Cluny, at its peak in the 12th century, administered a network of over 10,000 dependent monasteries and priories. The flow of goods through that network required infrastructure at scale. The infrastructure required entries at scale. The entries are still standing. But this explanation, accurate as it is, only resolves part of the measurement problem. A 4-metre entry accommodates a loaded draft horse. It does not require a 6-metre door. It does not explain why the proportional logic continued into spaces that had no logistical function, into throne rooms and private chapels and corridors that no cart ever entered. The scale exceeds what logistics explains. And this is where the history becomes genuinely strange, because the excess scale has a pattern consistent across cultures that had no contact with each other. The Forbidden City in Beijing, completed in 1420, has gates reaching 10 metres. The Buland Darwaza at Fatehpur Sikri in India reaches 54 metres, with a passable entry of roughly 20. These are processional and ceremonial. The conventional explanation, power, magnificence, the humbling of visitors, that explanation is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The ceremonial explanation requires a ceremony. It requires a procession, an audience, an event that the scale was designed to serve. Most of these spaces, most of the time, were not hosting ceremonies. They were being maintained, cleaned, repaired, restocked, and administered by workers who had no ceremonial function and who experienced the scale not as visitors meant to be humbled, but as inhabitants meant to operate within it. And the scale did not change for them. The high ceilings of the Palazzo Ducale were just as high on a Tuesday in February as they were during a state reception. The doors of Durham Cathedral opened to their full height for the delivery of grain, not only for the bishop's procession. What this means is that the scale was not only performed, it was lived in. And the question of why it was lived in at that scale, rather than at a scale appropriate to the humans who lived in it, is a question the economic history has not fully answered. There is a body of research, still marginal but growing, that approaches this from a different direction. It starts not with the buildings but with the labour records. In England, between roughly 1200 and 1600, wage records for construction projects show a consistent category of labourers described in the documents as great men, or in Latin as homines magni, who commanded wages between 2 and 3 times the standard daily rate for comparable physical work. These workers appear in the records of cathedral construction, castle building, and large monastic projects. They are listed alongside standard labourers but paid at a different rate without any documented explanation of a different skill set. The wage differential is noted by economic historians as anomalous. The premium wages exist. The explanation for them has been inferred. There is also the matter of construction speed. Chartres Cathedral was largely rebuilt between 1194 and 1220. That is 26 years for a structure of that scale and complexity. The labour force available has been estimated at between several hundred and a few thousand workers. The mechanical efficiency of medieval lifting equipment has been calculated. The numbers do not reconcile comfortably. Historians attribute the discrepancy to underestimated workforce size or organisational efficiency. The discrepancy is noted. The attribution is assumed. None of this constitutes proof of anything beyond what the documents show. Anomalous wages, anomalous construction timelines, buildings proportioned well beyond what the recorded inhabitants required. These are data points, they are not a theory. But taken together they describe a gap between what the official record contains and what the physical evidence suggests, and that gap has a consistent shape. The physical world is larger than the written record accounts for. The economic angle is where this becomes most verifiable, because economics leaves traces that other forms of history do not. Cut stone for the major building campaigns of the medieval period was priced at rates that imply a degree of precision and speed in quarrying and dressing operations that is difficult to reconcile with hand tools and standard labour. The price per unit of finished stonework in 13th century France implies either that labour was far cheaper than the wage records suggest, that the tools were far more efficient than surviving examples indicate, or that the workforce was achieving productivity that current models cannot explain. Economic historians note the anomaly. The explanations are the same ones applied to the wage records: underestimated efficiency, underdocumented technology, gaps in the record. What you are looking at across multiple independent lines of evidence is the consistent shape of something that has been edited out of the official account. Not through a single act of suppression, not through a coordinated conspiracy, but through the accumulated effect of centuries of interpretation that began with a particular set of assumptions about who built the ancient world and what scale they operated at. Those assumptions are embedded in every textbook and architectural survey. They are the water that the research swims in. Questioning them requires questioning not the evidence itself, but the frame through which the evidence has been interpreted. The frame was established gradually. Vitruvius, writing in the 1st century BC, gave Roman architecture a theoretical foundation that assumed human proportion as the governing principle. Palladio, in the 16th century, formalized that principle into the mathematical ratios that define classical architecture to this day. The human body as the measure of all built space. That framework is coherent, elegant, and internally consistent. But it explains the theory of what architects intended. It does not explain why the buildings are the size they are, because the buildings are not proportioned to the human body, they are proportioned to something larger. And the architects, who understood proportion better than anyone alive today, knew exactly what they were building and at what scale. The Vitruvian framework, applied to the actual measurements of the buildings that Vitruvius influenced, does not produce the buildings that exist. The buildings that exist produce measurements that fit a different body. This has been noted in passing by a handful of architectural historians who examined specific structures carefully enough to notice. The notes appear in footnotes and appendices. They are not developed. They are not connected to each other. They are left as curiosities in a field that has decided a priori that the framework is settled. Beethoven's tuning fork sits in a glass case in the British Library. The buildings that do not fit the human body are standing in every city in Europe. The wage records with the unexplained premium payments are in archives across England and France. The construction timelines that do not reconcile with the documented technology are in every serious study of medieval building economics. None of this is hidden. All of it is documented. What has not been done is the work of putting it in a single place and asking what shape it makes when you lay the pieces against each other. This video is that question, not the answer. The answer requires that economic historians, architectural historians, and the people who study pre-industrial labour records start reading each other's work in light of what the measurements actually show. That work has not happened yet because the framework says it does not need to happen, because the framework already knows what the buildings were for and who built them and at what scale human beings have always operated. The buildings disagree. They have been disagreeing for 500 years. And the 4-metre door in Venice opens to a room where 30 ordinary people sit, and has opened to that room every day for 5 centuries, and no one has stood in front of it and asked who the door was made for, because the answer the framework provides is so available and so satisfying and so completely unsupported by the actual measurement of a human being standing in that frame. The door is 4 meters tall. You are not.